Hey everybody. So I'm running out of sunlight. As if sunlight were a commodity that collects inside me and it's been leaking. No, I accidentally overused my battery in a phone call to my friend Andre, who lives in South Korea, where he is a teacher. And we talked about stuff related to entropy and something he's referring as syntropy and other very complex ideas, and we had a lot of fun. It was a great conversation. And I'm not sure how much time I have tonight with light, because behind me, in my neighborhood, which we call the Sunset, the sun is doing what my neighborhood is named for, and I'm at an intersection where I'm heading over to the park, or rather the garden that I love. But in order to do that, I've got to wait for lights to change. It's interesting, isn't it, that if you think carefully about our lives, you'll discover that machines have an unimaginably sophisticated impact on us. Most of our parents probably would never have met if not for their relationships with traffic lights. Those lights back there, let's see, can we see them from here? Yeah, I think there's one. Those things and many other machines determine where we will be at certain times and where we won't be at certain times, and what opportunities we may encounter or not encounter, and what threats we might encounter or not encounter, and all kinds of crazy stuff. And long ago in my 20s, a friend of mine named Gary Paolini and I, we composed like an industrial opera called Traffic Signal Man, about a guy who believed that both that car license plates were synchromystical messages to him, and that he could tell the future by reading traffic signals. So he would spend his days at a specific intersection reading both the car license plates and coupling that reading with the synchronization offered by the additional input of traffic signal timing. And now I'm in the garden that I love, this little garden. Though the main garden that I love is closed. And here's the beautiful Bruggemansia. There's a couple of them here. They are plants that are ordinarily pollinated at night. I think jasmine is a similar kind of plant, so they become extremely fragrant in the evening. However, the ones here, as I mentioned yesterday, have had most of their flowers snipped off. So what I want to talk about today, which has been on my mind all day, been waiting to make this video, and I don't know if I have enough time, so we'll give it my best shot, is the division between the public and the private, which is similar to the division between the general and the specific. When people like myself use the word we, ordinarily they're referring to some kind of generalization. And when they use the word I or me, they're referring to an individual. And unfortunately for most of us, our thinking about these topics is incredibly primitive. It's so primitive that it almost doesn't qualify as thinking. It qualifies as a unique kind of cognitive disease. Just saying hello to one of my favorite plants here. It's white sage that also had all its flowers snipped off by some idiotic gardener. So when we think about phenomenon and we use tokens, words, to refer to phenomenon, there's a couple of very important things going on that most of us are unaware of. The first is that we're using abstractions, right? So the idea that that is a tree is an abstraction. Tree is an abstraction of a sophisticated process of matching phenomenon to verbal categories and using tokens to point at phenomenon in nature and in our experience. And so, I'm gonna go to the great big lot here. So when we use language, we're manipulating abstractions. We're actually imposing a representational layer on top of our experience as animals. My apologies for the traffic noise. It's uncontrollable. Hopefully the phone doesn't pick up as much of it as I hear. That's how it seems to be from my experience yesterday. So most of us are unconscious of abstractions in that we confuse, either we don't notice that we're abstracting, or we confuse the tokens that we use to point at phenomenon with the phenomenon themselves. So that I think those are actually trees. They aren't. Those are phenomena so sophisticated that they might be more sophisticated than everything humans have ever learned about anything. I don't know how sophisticated they are. Our knowledge about any phenomenon in nature, any phenomena, I always get the plural wrong on that. I can't remember which is the plural and which is the singular of phenomenon. I think phenomena is the plural, but I can't remember. In any case, the fact that we have tokens about phenomena implies to us, unfortunately, that we understand them, or that our understanding of them is relatively complete, when in fact the absolute opposite is the case. What we have is a very modest grasp on some phenomenon that we can distinguish, right, like a tree or trees. And we have classes that comprise sets. So like there's the set of vegetable organisms or vegetation organisms that belong in the set of vegetation. And then we have instances like, trees, or a birch tree, or a cedar tree, so on and so forth. So we have this really sophisticated classification system. We've got all these tokens, and most of us are not aware that when we're using language, we're participating in a habit that places an overlay on experience and divides it up various ways for various reasons and stuff like this. Now, sometimes we're aware that we're making an abstraction when, for example, we make a model. We may know or realize or be aware that a model isn't the same thing as the phenomenon to which it refers, right? In other words, one of the conveniences of being able to model things is that we're incapable of including all the information about any phenomenon, even the simplest phenomenon, except maybe phenomenon in language. In that one instance, we might be able to include most or all of the information. Because language is an overlay we invented, and it's relatively simple. By which I mean, compared to the things language encodes, it's relatively simple. So when we're using language, we're engaged in forming abstractions. And we might be aware that we're doing that when we use a model, because we realize that the model doesn't contain all of the information about a subject or referent, or in formal terms, the nominatum of like that which it points to. So we understand that models don't contain all the information about that which they model, right? A simulation doesn't contain all the information about that which it simulates. In fact, to contain all the information about anything, you'd probably have to include all the information about everything, because somewhere you make a division, right, between that distinguishes a phenomenon or an event or a situation, so on and so forth. Somewhere you, with your mind, you make cuts, right, in the everything, and we use language, and actually categories are the first cut that we make, and then instances are usually the second cut. Just as when I say there's everything, there are organisms, there are plants, animals, there's vegetation, there's microorganisms, there's viruses, so on and so forth, right? We're making slices in the everything, but those slices are not intrinsic to the stuff we're cutting up with our minds. And if we were aware of making those cuts, we could do it much more intelligently than we ordinarily do. Furthermore, if we were aware that we are in a playground, in a sandbox of abstractions, we would again avoid many catastrophic errors of thought and ideation and opinion and perspective and so on. It would be amazing if, when we'd been endowed with the capacity to use language and to engage in conceptual thought, we had been trained about the dangers and the pitfalls and the confusions that come along with that. Ordinarily, if you're going to give a child something that's dangerous, you teach them how to use that thing intelligently so they don't injure themselves or others or the universe or the world with it. In the case of language, apparently most of the adults don't realize how incredibly dangerous it is. And the vast majority of adults are completely unconscious of these dangers, and are not only do they not teach their children about them, they're incapable of recognizing them themselves unless they are trained to do so. And there are various ways one can become trained in this. One can study semantics and linguistics, which could help you, but won't necessarily give you the medicine you need. There's the very exotic, sorry, I have the hiccups, and slightly insane work that I nonetheless absolutely recommend if you've got a stomach for it, of Alfred Korzybski, the founder of general semantics and what he refers to as non-Aristotelian logic. And my friend Nathan Binema is going to be giving some coursework on those topics. You can look him up on Facebook. I think it's Binema. And there are other people who might be able to teach you something about general semantics, which I think is a extremely sophisticated analysis of the underlying problems that humans have in relating to each other and themselves and the worlds and their own consciousness through language. But lately, we're in a very unusual situation. And one of the things that's going on in this situation, one demonstration of the problems we have in our relationships with language and knowledge that I wanted to highlight today, is that I think people have a great deal of trouble, some people have, in some situations, have a great deal of trouble distinguishing between their idea of something and the thing itself. They can't tell the difference, and they think those two things are equivalent. They think, for example, their idea of what's going on is relatively equivalent to what's going on. There's no possibility of that ever being true, because whatever what's going on is so unimaginably sophisticated that it would be impossible to form an idea that resembles it. Impossible. It will never happen. No one will ever succeed at that. And so one of the problems here is that it's very easy to confuse generalizations with a situation or circumstance. And people do this in language all the time. They make generalizations about humans, right? They'll say, for example, Americans are naive. When really, if you got any specific American in front of you, some of them might be naive about some things and completely not about others. And so, in fact, that statement's kind of ironic, because when someone says something like, oh, well, Americans are naive, what's actually going on is that person's naive about language, right? That person doesn't understand the capacity of language to completely misdirect our attention, our awareness, our cognition, our potential for intelligence, our opinions, our ideas, and so on and so forth. And because many people in many situations are confused in this way, what we get are these conflicting storms of ever more, emphatically insisted upon nonsense. Particularly right now, when people are trying to understand a sophisticated array of phenomenon, right? A constellated array of layered phenomenon, and they're thinking about it as if it's a single thing, right? So that they'll say something like, they'll use the phrase the coronavirus to refer to a vastly constellated array of phenomena and behaviors and observations, opinions, research. Like you could throw anything in that salad, right? And they are inclined to think and suggest that this is a single phenomenon. You can speak that way. Language allows you to make that kind of mistake. But unless you're specifically referring only to the referent pointed at by the phrase the coronavirus, meaning you're referring to a specific viroid, SARS-CoV-2. Not anything it does, not what people do about it, none of that. Unless you're referring just to that thing, you're misusing language. And even if you're referring just to that thing, you're probably not conscious of the fact that you're engaging in abstraction, right? You're not yet conscious of the fact that you're engaging in abstraction, which means you're using toys, verbal toys, in a game that refers to some phenomenon that's incompletely understood by anyone, by everyone. And you're doing so in a way that at least has the potential to confuse you into thinking that you know what you're talking about, right? And we all do this all day long. I'm no exception, even though I have some degree of consciousness of abstracting, and I have some training in general semantics. So the problem is really complicated, because I want to explain something about whatever it is the coronavirus might refer to. And what I want to say is that, first of all, whenever we're talking about something, we're at least in part talking about everything. Because the something is part of the everything. And everything, it's not that everything is connected, it's that you start out with a unity, right? And then you make specifically intentional, purposive cuts in that unity to be able to distinguish and thus refer to some specific aspect of the unity, right? And some potential relationships or causal phenomena within, what you're referring to. Whatever's going on with the human species and the pathogen that we currently refer to as the novel coronavirus is an unimaginably sophisticated phenomenon. I can't express the sophistication of this, but it's not being captured in our thought or our opinion or our minds at all. What we're doing instead is we're pretending that generalizations capture the phenomenon adequately, and they don't. That's the problem. That's like pretending that if you look at humans in general, you'll be able to figure out what Darren will do in the next 2 minutes, which you can't. Although you might be able to make very simple generalizations that would be accurate, such as he'll probably continue breathing. So my point here is that I want to be very clear. The phenomenon that we refer to with the phrase the coronavirus is an unimaginably complex phenomenon with ostensibly trillions of variables. And even if we eliminate vast portions of those, if we pare the phenomenon down to a cognitively and intellectually manageable set of features, which is part of how we do science, by the way, and how we do medicine, because otherwise you have to include everything, which you can't do, right? Think about it. Someone comes to you, they're sick, Well, I'm afraid you're afflicted with the Big Bang. What? Yes, the fact that the universe exists resulted in you having this illness. That's the actual causal factor in what's going on. Like, everything is the cause of you, right? Everything is... What would you exclude causally from your state? Right? Everything is involved. So we pare things down, right? And we say, well, there's a pathogen, and we do very specific testing to determine whether or not this pathogen is associated with the syndrome, right, the complex constellation of symptoms and effects we can observe, which is always incomplete because we don't see all the symptoms or effects, not even in a single person, ever, right? There will always be symptoms and effects, always, that are unobservable to us because either they're too numerous, we have not discovered how to distinguish them, right? We can't perceive them. The human body is so astonishingly complex. There's all kinds of cells in the body that we haven't even discovered yet, including immune cells and so on. So our knowledge is always partial, it's always incomplete. This is particularly true in a very complex situation like the one we're in at present. And most of what's going on is unknown, right? We've got a handle on some very tiny pieces of this puzzle, we being human society, and primarily that subset of society composed of medical researchers, theorists, molecular biologists, virologists, epidemiologists, physicians, nurses, and other medical practitioners who have some actual education and experience of the phenomenon that we all are suddenly very concerned about. So it's a mistake to presume, for example, that because social distancing worked and was sufficient in one place, that it will always work and always be sufficient in some other place. Everything has local variables. Now, that particular assertion that if social distancing was effective in reducing the rate of contagion in one place, that will likely be true in another, that's a relatively reliable assertion. But the assertion that the reverse of that, right, that people who didn't practice social distancing in place A and didn't get obliterated over, 20 days, means that social distancing was a bad idea, that's just not true. The reason it's not true is that it's the wrong use of a generalization. It's a bad use of a generalization. There are distinct features that affect contagion, severity of illness, efficacy of treatment, efficacy of testing, efficacy of prophylactic measures. There are probably locational variables, genetic variables, variables in the strain of the virus, variables in conditions that we have no grasp of, or that we cannot even represent to ourselves yet. So what we have is a big question mark with some tiny little islands of knowledge that we've managed. When I say we, I mean researchers in general and the societies that are attempting to come to terms with what our experts are telling us, right? And there's this vast backlash against expertise, right? Why should the medical expert's opinion be the one that matters? Well, if you can't understand that, it's going to be difficult to convince you otherwise. But essentially, when you're in a complex situation with a bunch of variables that you're untrained in examining, what you want, hopefully, is people with the training to help you understand and give you, best evidence models of the phenomenon and the reasonably expectable sequelae or consequences of that phenomenon. You don't want people guessing. You don't want people intuiting it. You don't want them, praying to clouds in the sky about it. You want actual data, especially if millions of lives are at risk, right? And in this case, that's the case. Millions of lives are at risk. Many people have already died. People are arguing in ways about this that are both childish and insane. And part of the reason they're doing that is that they're not aware that the phenomenon is incredibly sophisticated. The sophistication of the human immune system. So first of all, I'm making generalizations there. I'm talking about the human immune system, right? So I'm talking about a general idea that I propagate across all human beings, yeah? But what we need to understand, and what I want to make very clear, and in case this isn't obvious from the situation we're in, it should be, each individual organism is just as unique as it is similar to its class. That's the key thing I'm trying to communicate here, okay? Each individual organism is at least as locally unique as it is similar to the class we use to refer to it with. And this is the thing that people are having a hard time wrapping their minds around. They think that because you're human, your Jim is just the same as Jill. Well, it's not true. That's why some people have 0 symptoms and other people die. If that's not a significant enough difference for you to understand, it's going to be really hard for me to show you one that will be. And this is the primary thing that I wanted to communicate today. Though I think I'm going to run out of time. Actually, I'm going to run out of light. So I may remake this video. We'll see what happens. But essentially what I want to get across to you is the idea that individual instances of a situation are extremely unique. And so the fact that, for example, someplace on Earth that doesn't immediately lock down, yet doesn't experience a vast preponderance of infections and deaths, in no fucking way means that it's safe to not lock down. What it means at best is that local variables in that particular place have thus far turned out to produce less illnesses and deaths than we might otherwise have predicted. The idea that that's true for all other places because that happened there is insane and simply incorrect. It's provably wrong, right? You've got places that have locked down, essentially, and still have catastrophic illness and death rates. You've got other places that were relatively moderate in their transformation of their social behavior and don't have significant we don't see significant statistics from those places, or the statistics appear momentarily to be largely insignificant. Those statistics are very fuzzy and they're prone to radical transformation over time. And everybody needs to remain aware that there are unique variables in every person, in every place, in every location, in every city, in every village, everywhere. And those unique variables, including initial inoculation rates, initial strains, the genetic diversity of the population there, and all kinds of other things, contribute to the outcomes we perceive statistically. And those statistical outcomes are wildly incomplete. So you don't want to go around pretending that you understand what the hell's going on with the coronavirus because you got your hands on some numbers or you read a news article. That's an insane idea. What's actually going on is a phenomenon so sophisticated that our modern societies are ill-equipped to completely understand it, let alone, that people reading news articles are going to suddenly become paragons of knowledge and be able to tell you, here's what's actually going on. This is the real truth. That's insane and impossible. That's not true. That'll never be true. There's no one who understands what's going on. The complexity of the phenomenon we are presently facing, which goes vastly beyond the coronavirus into, the history of medical science, how human societies function, what capitalist nations do and are about. There's the sophistication is off the charts, right? So the main idea that I want to communicate here, though, is relatively simple, and it's this. It is that perspectives based on generalizations and statistics give you only a very modest grasp on what will actually happen in individual contexts, circumstances, populations, and human beings. Each individual place, person, situation is going to vary. And it's going to vary for reasons, some of which we can acquire awareness and intelligence about, and some of which must remain invisible to us, because our grasp on phenomenon is necessarily incomplete, and language is prone to deceive us about that. That's it for now. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.